Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The Riley Lewis Show. I'm your host, Riley Lewis. Happy Wednesday. We have a lot to get into today, so let's just get started. So, we're starting with a story coming to us from the Los Angeles Times, in which there is a lot of internal tension, allegedly, about racial equity, which is also coupled with concerns that some journalists. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The Riley Lewis Show. I'm your host, Riley Lewis. Happy Wednesday. We have a lot of news to get into, so let's just start talking about it. We begin with a story coming to us from the Los Angeles Times about some perceived discrepancies in racial equity, which is coupled with concerns that some journalists share about the organization's coverage of recent demonstrations, protests, the sort of nonviolent and more violent aspects of it, as well as, of course, these protests following the several high-profile police killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, most recently. Of course, 3, 2, 1. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The Riley Lewis Show. I'm your host, Riley Lewis. We have a lot to get into today, so let's just start talking about it. We begin this Wednesday with an interesting story coming to us from the Los Angeles Times about some perceived discrepancies in racial equity, which is coupled with concerns that some journalists share about the organization's coverage of the recent demonstrations, protests, looting, rioting, all of the movements that have broken out following several high-profile police killings, including Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and most recently Rayshard Brooks. Now, I should also say that this article mentions something interesting about unfulfilled promises of a diverse staff of writers and more diversity in both perspective and in coverage. Now, according to NPR, some journalists at the LA Times are launching what they call an internal uprising to voice anger over perceived racial injustice. Now, I say perceived or alleged because I think that is definitely the interpretation and diagnosis of some journalists at the LA Times, but it doesn't seem to reflect to me the entire sentiment of the LA Times. That said, interpretation, like I'm saying, is sometimes things are subject to interpretation. I think that this is certainly one of those things. The executive editor of the Los Angeles Times, Norman Pearlstein, has issued a statement to NPR saying, quote, "In the case of black journalists, we do not have enough journalists in positions where they are able to help us tell stories that really need to be told," which, again, doesn't sound like that would come from someone who is perpetuating racial inequity. It sounds like they're actually making racial equity a huge part of their goal. But again, this appears to be a representation problem and also something of a coverage problem, which, of course, is really important because the way you cover or frame something in the news greatly influences the way that people interpret what's going on and form opinions. To that point, I personally do just want to say here that I really understand what it feels like to scroll through 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 55 headlines and really not feel represented by any of the headlines or any of the madness. And to that point, one of the core elements, if you just like search up traditional journalism, one of the core elements of it in the top 5 is fair representation. You're supposed to represent all sides of the story. Journalism is about being disciplined. And this is something I can definitely work on. I think that this is something most journalists can work on. Not to say that I'm a journalist yet. But in any case, this is what's really being alleged. There is a representation problem. Some of these journalists are basically saying that the way in which the LA Times has framed the rioting and the more revolutionary parts of the looting as bad, which I honestly think it is bad, because it's not going to get you any closer to justice or peace, but that's a different conversation. In any case, what's basically being said is that the way you are framing the story is pandering to white voters, white voters, but also like white viewers and patrons of the LA Times. That's basically the accusation. In addition to the LA Times, There have been resignations, by the way, at several other major news publications, such as the New York Times and even the Philadelphia Inquirer. Now, on one hand, diversity is certainly one of our biggest strengths, right? I mean, diversity is, strength in numbers. Diversity is what makes the human experience so rich. Diversity. And by the way, I should also say that justice in journalism is a good core pillar to have. However, really for me, the problem here is the same boy who cried wolf problem that I was really describing in just yesterday's, and that I've really described in previous episodes. The issue is that some journalists and mainstream media news organizations have this idea that there is a complete lack of diversity as, oh, shoot. All right, cut. And 3, 2, 1. Okay. In any case, in addition to this lack of diversity that is sort of being brought to light here, there are certain journalists who also claim that the paper, again, is really pandering to their white readers. In one specific case, a film reporter for the Los Angeles Times, Sanaya Kelly, said that the newspaper was focusing too much on looting, which is clearly a more negative element of the demonstrations, right? Because it's not really promoting peace, it's promoting chaos. And by the way, this was, grabbed from an internal Slack message, but in any case, Kelly, who is an African American, released a statement about the LA Times and their coverage of the looting, stating the following, quote, "We can't constantly pander to our primarily white audience with stories like this that affirm their biases," referring again to headlines about the looting. Now, let me just say why I don't think that's totally fair. Because no biases are being affirmed. When you go out and just start burning things to the ground, you give people a reason to be critical or skeptical. So I don't really think that that's affirming anyone's biases. I think that people are just honestly calling balls and strikes, and like many other organizations, honestly, the LA Times has been very mild about their coverage, considering that there's been so much destructive activity in the city of Los Angeles in the last 3 weeks or so. So actually, I think that the LA Times is being really mild. What I think honestly is going on here is that any journalist in the 21st century who disagrees with a headline that is being published by their organization feels the need to let the world know that it's a problem, effectively making their problem our problem. And honestly, I think it's a little childish. I think the LA Times has been very fair about saying that destructive activity is destructive. It's not hateful to speak the truth. So I just think that that's really what's going on here. In any case, it's really clear that this journalist is indeed upset, and I do want to honor those feelings because, again, I do want to respect the fact that this media is toxic. That's true. That's why I'm here, and I've said that before. And it definitely does run on outrage, so I understand why a journalist and a film reporter would be upset about that. And also, these news organizations, they never really seem to issue any sincere apology to the people if they go too far. They just stop and hope that everybody forgets 24 hours later. So I honest to God, I mean, I do know what it's like to read the daily news and just have hot steam coming out of each of your ears at the same time, because the mainstream media is just distorting reality, or maybe just fabricating news, like literally just making news up, or they're gaslighting or embellishing or editorializing. Sometimes it's more subtle, sometimes it's really explicit, and I understand why someone who's especially working on the inside, because I'm looking at this from the outside, I understand why she would be really frustrated that even the LA Times wants to just stick to certain narratives. And I think that, again, what's not really fair is that most of the time people agree with those narratives if they go in one certain direction politically. I will not mention that direction. But if they go a certain slant, then everybody agrees with the headlines. But if there's ever one that dissents, then you get reporters and journalists that literally, have, you get journalists so upset that they kind of, lash out. And I just think it's interesting that anytime there's an article that a journalist doesn't agree with, they feel so entitled that they have to let the world know that it's not okay. Kelly continued to write, though, and trying to honor her feelings. One of the responsibilities of the job is to state the facts and tell it true, which is true, and that's what they were doing about the looting. Quote, there's so much implicit bias in those few sentences alone, and it's alienating the viewers we're trying to attract, as well as people of color and journalists like me who contribute so much to this paper and then have to read stories like this that oversimplify our struggles and realities. Again, I don't think anyone's oversimplifying a reality. I think people actually are reporting on the reality, and that's the problem, because sometimes the reality is not what you expect or what you have in your mind, and maybe the reality in your mind is a lot softer and nicer than what's actually going on in the streets, for example, in Seattle right now, in the autonomous zone. That's reality. That's real. So I totally agree with all of that, but I don't think they're oversimplifying at the LA Times. I don't. This is a powerful passage, though, in any case, and I can tell that she is being sincere, and the article does present some damning evidence in favor of Kelly's point. For example, there is only just one single African-American reporter on the biggest desk at the LA Times, the Metro desk, which is a team that hosts nearly 90 people. So out of nearly 90 people, there's only one African-American man in a city that's LA, that's supposed to be representing the people and the diversity of Los Angeles. So that is really, really telling. I will give her that one. And this does really reflect a certain hiring trend, I think. But again, I don't really like this indictment that the Times poorly covered protests and looting, because it seems like, frankly, anytime anyone wants to cover looting or the more revolutionary aspects of the protests, then people get so sensitive about it, and they think that, they think it's practically like violence to cover the violence. And I just think that that's really emblematic of how sensitive we are. Like, just as a populace, we're that sensitive that we can condemn police violence, but we can't just condemn violence across the board. We can't just say all life is equally important. We can't just make simple statements anymore, common sense statements anymore, because people just take everything over the top, and they run to their Twitter sphere and they just tweet madly because they're an online warrior with an online PhD and whatever it is that we're talking about in the moment. In any case, Kelly continued to say that journalism is about the truth and telling it how it is, and that is true, and I do totally agree with her. She's right. And I think that, honestly, sometimes even journalists, people can't always handle the truth because, again, it conflicts with the reality that they want to believe. And this is a phenomenon that really does not know any boundaries: race, color, creed, national origin, gender identity, sexual orientation. This is something that can happen with all of us. So I think that, to be fair, that might be what's going on. Sometimes as a journalist, I would imagine you're so deep in the news all the time that it's hard for you to pop your head up and just try to stay cool and as close to center and objective as you can. You get really, really caught in the middle of it. Now, the owner of the newspaper, Patrick Soon-Shiong, has released several statements regarding the Times, their staff, and their dedication to inclusivity, as well as their passion for telling important stories. Regarding the hiring of the new executive editor, again, Norman Pearlstein, he said, Soon-Shiong said, I hired Norman Pearlstein not only for his integrity and passion for great journalism, but also because he shared our desire to create a leadership team where women and people of color are ascendant. So basically, this is new leadership, and I think a lot of the criticisms of the LA Times are from the old world LA Times, but they have a new owner and they have a new executive editor, and I think they will soon have a much newer, updated staff. In any case, Soon-Shiong and Pearlstein have both pledged to continue to diversify their newsroom, such that their newsroom really reflects the rich diversity of the city they cover, Los Angeles. In any case, moving on, turns out that one scientist predicted that 2020 would be chaos, and that was a jackpot prediction, because totally right. Coming to us from Time magazine, there's a piece titled, "This researcher predicted 2020 would be mayhem. Here's what he says may come next," which is always exciting and anxiety-inducing. Peter Turchin, who is a professor of cultural evolution at the University of Connecticut, claimed 10 years ago that the United States would experience wide civil unrest around 2020. How exactly did Turchin know that it would be around 2020, between 2017 and 2022? He knows this after years of studying and analyzing various cycles of civil instability in U.S. history. And Turchin came to the conclusion that By studying history, it was quite likely that the United States would undergo tremendous civil instability around the year 2020 because we have some sort of repeated trends or patterns that traditionally or historically have led to civil unrest. Now, without including the previous political instability, both in the US and the world, in the years before 2020, because it's not like everything was perfectly stable and then 2020 happened, right? I mean, we don't have to get into what's going on in world affairs pre-2020, but before coronavirus, a lot of parts of the world were already on fire, so that's not something new in some regard. However, some of it is certainly new. And I just, let's just, we're basically halfway through 2020. So let's think about 2020 so far. We started the year with the impeachment of the president and then the acquittal of the president, which was a much bigger deal if you remember at the time, followed by a global pandemic that has killed at least 100,000 people, coupled with the worst economic crisis that we have seen in nearly 100 years. And then we have the brutal murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks. Now, in terms of culture, politics, government, society, we're basically completely breaking down. That's what's going on. We're hitting bottom. This is, I hope this is bottom. I think we're bottoming out. In just the last few weeks, again, we've seen police arrest journalists. We've seen police kill people. We've seen police officers be killed. We've seen peaceful protesters attacked by police. We've seen stores and restaurants set on fire and their owners brutalized. And somehow this scientist was able to see it all coming by looking at the past. Why do we study history? Why do we study US history? Why do we study social studies? This is exactly why we study history. This is exactly why we study social studies. This is exactly why it's important to know about previous presidents. All of this that's going on right now in the world is exactly why I got my bachelor's degree in political science. This is exactly why I'm going to get my master's degree in peace and justice, because of everything that's going on right now. So there's your answer. Why study history? Why study the past? Now. This is a great example. Now, right now. That's why. According to Time magazine, Turchin studied the violent and nonviolent anti-government mobilizations in the United States between the years 1780 and 2010. Each movement must have had at least 100 people in order to be counted in the computer model that was used, which also factored in various socioeconomic conditions such as decrease in wages, ballooning national debt, skyrocketing wealth inequality, and many other things that we've seen in previous periods in American history. Now, Turchin and I actually have a shared fear here that the boiling tensions responsible for such a dramatic shift in our social and political atmospheres really may be overlooked by those who occupy the power to articulate the needs and concerns of the people. Put simply, if our politicians in Congress never manage to actually understand why people would want to vote for someone like Trump, then I think we're doomed. If they're never able to actually reflect and understand where maybe they haven't completely fulfilled the American people's needs, and instead just double down on what they were doing anyway, then I think we are in big trouble. Now, Turchin pointed to South Africa as an example of this point of political instability, which is one of the countries with the greatest levels of wealth inequality, for example. Long after the days of apartheid, almost 30 years later, South Africa is still rife with apartheid-era problems that they've inherited that perpetuate political instability, such as wealth inequality. Now, the United States, though I really should say I do love to live here, and I am happy to be here. This is a country with some unusually high inequalities for such a wealthy, developed, and innovative country. Now, deliberation about healthcare, for example, education, job opportunities and wages, high school enrollment and college opportunities, and overall wealth inequality have really been topics in mainstream American politics for at least a decade now. However, I think all of these things on top of coronavirus, the lockdown, unemployment, and then these police misconduct cases really was just, it set the powder keg ablaze, and here we are, just in the middle of the storm. In any case, to sort of finalize here, this scientist was somehow able to predict chaos, which makes me think that we could also predict solutions too. So I actually think that this is really good news, and I would encourage everybody to start reading about past. Read about the US history, read about world history between 1780 and 2010, study up between violent movements and nonviolent movements, and look at how successful they were. I mean, arguably, the violent movements of the 1960s with more revolutionary tendencies are responsible for enough people wanting to vote for Richard Nixon. I mean, that because if people had been non-violent or less violent, or at least some people had, then maybe people would have gone the other way. I mean, maybe that literally swayed an election. This is also an election year right now, and maybe this is all going to be cannon fodder for Trump. So it really, it's really just interesting. But I would encourage people anyway to just go back through history and to read, because the more you read about the past, the more the present will make sense to you, and the more you will be able to look into the future. That said, speaking about the future, let's talk about an executive order that the president just signed. The president has recently signed an executive order that places some restrictions on funding for police departments, a move that Democrats say does not go far enough. More specifically, this order mandates that the Department of Justice only allocate discretionary funds to departments that are certified in police training tactics that also include de-escalation training. Additionally, these departments must ensure that the use of chokeholds, if they're ever to be used, is reserved for life-threatening situations, again, if they're ever to be used. That's not totally clear yet. Pressure from groups such as Black Lives Matter to defund or abolish the police have placed the president in a pretty difficult situation, especially considering that this is the summer again before a national election. Biden, too, also has found himself under pressure from a variety of liberal activist groups, such as Black Voters Matter, to push for stricter policies that would reduce funding and resources for law enforcement, basically reducing their presence overall. Now, I do find it odd that people want to live in a safer world, but they want to get rid of law enforcement. I think it's just like it's ironic. It's just like the protesters in the autonomous zone of Seattle who say they're autonomous, but then have a long list of demands they need from the capitalist system from which they're rebelling. So it's like, we don't like capitalism. Also, bring us pants and more clothing and portable chargers and Gatorade, which is very ironic. In any case, activist groups are calling on Biden to endorse a 21-page proposal that would result in less incarceration and a smaller, more benign police presence overall. Now, I do agree that we have an incarceration problem, and we have thousands of people who go behind bars for very silly offenses, such as the possession of marijuana. Additionally, people are wrongfully convicted regularly in the criminal justice system, and that's a huge problem. That said, I think the solution actually requires more funding for more training so that police officers and departments can be more prepared in the field, less reactive, and therefore less lethal. I think that for police to be more precise with their behavior and to be more well trained actually requires more funding. But again, just more irony for your day. In any case, President Trump's taken a lot of criticism about the executive order from congressional Democrats, saying that it does not go too far, or it does not go far enough. Some of the president's other plans for reform, though, do include incentives for local law enforcement to create a database for tracking officer misconduct, which is something that has been discussed since the early 1990s, actually, but was not carried out by 4 previous U.S. presidents. Now, according to the Washington Post, the president announced these new policies in a ceremony at the Rose Garden while surrounded by officers who were in uniform, which is indicative of his support, or at least, symbolic support of police and police unions. Again, this is not surprising. The president's made it clear that justice will be served, but he's also made it clear that he is a law and order president, so of course he's going to have police at that outing. To be fair, though, to all sides here, this is really a difficult situation. Governing a society, especially a society that is composed of hundreds of millions of people, really is not ever going to be that easy. And you can see this pressure really come around even to haunt Joe Biden, for example, who's, since the passage of the 1994 crime bill, which is partially responsible for more incarceration, has actually come back to haunt Joe Biden. So it's like we have less crime, but Biden is still in trouble now. So you sign an executive order, it doesn't go far enough. You don't sign one, it doesn't go far enough. A lot of this stuff you can't win. A lot of times in politics, you just can't win. Somebody's always going to be upset about what you're doing. Now, this event, like all other Trump outings, by the way, was an affair that was filled with tension. Despite a speech from the president that I actually thought was quite nice, activists and some journalists are definitely suspicious of his sincerity, which is fair. To be fair, the president really has not demonstrated a great ability to tune in to the needs of the people, so critics really are hesitant to listen to him. To that point, though, if the president, if the president says something good, I think that we should talk about that. And of the many empathetic statements that the president made at the ceremony, one of the most powerful phrases was, quote, "I can never imagine your pain or the depth of your anguish, but I can promise to fight for justice for all of our people." And I think that that's actually just a really nice quote referring to the terrible injustices that have been committed against George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, and many, many others, unfortunately. Now, Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader, has expressed some criticism of this executive order, despite all of the speech around it, claiming that it simply just does not go far enough. This is exactly, by the way, this is happening. Meanwhile, congressional Democrats and Republicans are under pressure from the public to create and pass massive reforms in policing procedures and police laws that would basically alter police or make it easier to hold police accountable or alter the police-civilian sort of dynamic. For example, overturning the qualified immunity doctrine that makes it difficult to sue police officers. Schumer, by the way, had this to say about the executive order, quote, "Unfortunately, this executive order will not deliver comprehensive, meaningful change and accountability in our nation's police departments that Americans are demanding." Critics also raised concerns, by the way, about the ability to create legislation that prevents legal hurdles, again, such as the qualified immunity doctrine, to protect police officers from facing charges for their misconduct. In cases of police misconduct, there should be a trial by jury in which the plaintiff and the defendant are able to make their case. But the problem here, though, in cases such as George Floyd, is that the defendant is literally no longer with us, and they're not able to state their case before a court, and so the court defaults to the police officer, who is the only person who gets to tell an event or tell a version of the story, and then they have to just basically listen to whatever that officer said unless there's footage. And then when the footage comes in, that makes it different. But imagine all of these things happening without body cams and smartphones. Then what would happen, right? Now, this article from the Washington Post also highlights the fact that the president has said that he is willing to work with Congress to pass further legislation. However, again, congressional Democrats have expressed their doubts about that. Now, Democrats want to pursue further measures in police reform, such as totally banning chokeholds and making it easier for a citizen to sue a law enforcement officer, effectively holding officers accountable for their actions, also holding them accountable to the same laws that everybody else is held accountable to. Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, also has claimed that the order was not good enough, and she said that it, quote, "fell seriously short." Finally, Senate Republicans and House Democrats really are both developing their own legislative proposals for addressing the concerns of the American people and police malpractice as a whole, and I really do have a hunch that we are on the brink of some truly meaningful change that is going to greatly alter the future. And okay, so that brings us to our final story of the day today, which is an update on the investigation into the murder of Rayshard Brooks, who was shot and killed last week in Atlanta by a police officer named Garrett Rolfe. The officer in question, again Rolfe, has since been fired and charged with felony murder and aggravated assault. Now, Rolfe's lawyer has claimed that his actions were indeed justified. However, the Fulton County District Attorney, Paul Howard, has said that this murder was absolutely not justified. The Brooks family has said also that these charges, while a good first step, are really just a first step toward justice on a long journey for Rayshard and for the African American community overall. To that end, the DA has said that officers involved still need to be indicted and tried in a courtroom, which will likely have to wait until next year. Now, the Brooks family attorney, Chris Stewart, had this to say about the charges, quote, "Maybe one day this country will get it right with policing and we'll all come together." In summary, really, I think that this is going to lead to a lot of reform for cops who do truly abuse their power and their badge, especially those who have abused their power to the point of murder. I also hope to see a more holistic dialogue about policing, police review, and police tactics, such as de-escalation tactics and other nonviolent measures for working with assailants. Furthermore, I should say that the police really do deal with a lot of unfortunate and difficult situations that most people do not want to handle, and so I think that we need to understand that, but also I think that those people, have great power, and with great power does come great responsibility. So police officers, like any other person living here, should be subject to the same laws and the same rules as all of the other people living here. Furthermore, public demonstrations that we've seen over the last few weeks about the recent string of police murders in Minneapolis, Louisville, and Atlanta have sparked nationwide continuous protests that are really pressuring politicians, including the president and Joe Biden, to act. Now, the officer Garrett Rolfe, who killed Brooks, is currently facing up to 11 different charges, which again is a step, but in the eyes of the Brooks family attorney, Vanita Gupta, it's not a step far enough. Again, Gupta, who is the president of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, has criticized this measure, saying that these charges simply do not go far enough, and it's not enough of a step toward justice. That said, that wraps up everything for today's episode of The Riley Lewis Show. I appreciate your time and your ear today. I appreciate the support. If you like my content and you want to support me and support my show, you can hit that subscribe button down below. You can also like this video and leave me a comment in the comment section down below. Let me know how I'm doing. Additionally, you can visit the link in the description of this video to my Patreon page, where you can sign up and make a donation, or you can visit my Anchor.fm page, or visit me on the Anchor.fm mobile app at The Riley Lewis Show. And then you can visit my virtual wallet, and you can also support me there. You've been listening to The Riley Lewis Show. I will see you here again tomorrow.